Warm good morning to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the important articles which have appeared in the international edition of today's The Hindu newspaper, analyze them in detail for your relevance in the prelims as well as for the mains examination. Now, today we are going to have a discussion for various different topics. The annotated PDFs of the same session can be downloaded from the Telegram channel and the link which is indicated here. So these are the overall 8 different topics that we are going to discuss in varying different lengths and depth as required for the examination. Now, 3 of them are going to be much more detailed because of their relevance in the mains examination. That is, a reset in West Asia, a de-escalation for the world. Now, this follows basically the announcement of ceasefire in between Iran and Israel. Now, that was brokered by US, and what are the implications of this fragile region of West Asia going ahead into the future? This has appeared in the editorial section. This is relevant for the IR portion, yes, paper 2. Nuclear Spectre also talks about the aspect of disarming Iran with its nuclear enrichment facilities. Now, whether that is good or that is bad, that is something we are going to analyze. Now, again, what we are going to do is because both of them deal with the same specter and the same area of discussion, we are going to merge these two and then hold a comprehensive discussion at the end of it. This is also relevant for your GS paper 2. The need for gender equity in urban bureaucracy. Now, when it comes to urban administration and urban governance, the local governance, there the acute little representation of women folk that is having a real time implication in terms of how our urban areas are developing and the lack of planning when it comes to the gender based issues in the urban areas. What are they? Now, that is important. That is again GS paper 2. Now, rest of the articles that you see, those we are going to discuss in brief, but wherever required, going into the depth for the prelims purposes. US's heavy duty attack on Iran's nuke sites. There has been a detailed article talking about the B-2 stealth bomber. What that article talks about, we are going to discuss. For the first time, India breaks into top 100 in the Global Sustainable Development Goal rankings. So, which is this report which has been indicated? We are going to discuss what are the various sustainable development goals. That is again something we are going to browse at. And what are the highlights of this particular report that is beyond the article in itself? So, again, we will use this opportunity to discuss those issues. Crushed stone for carbon capture. Now, what is this concept of enhanced rock weathering, ERW? Now, UPSC had asked a previous year question, that is last year itself, based upon the concept that you see here. Now, even though it might appear to be a question of environment, but then with the help of the PYQ, I will show you how it was a question and a question of geography can be framed out of it. Central banks eye gold, yuan, and euro as dollar wanes. The demand of these currencies are increasing and the demand of dollar is decreasing. Now, there is a place in news that is the region and the island of Chios, which is to the eastern portion of Greece in the Aegean Sea. Where that is situated and why that is in news, that is something we are going to discuss. But I hope for places in news section, you are referring to a comprehensive compiled video that we have put up on our YouTube channel for the places in news, and we are doing it month wise, and we have done that for the month of May. Places in news and species in news is already uploaded on the channel for the month of May. For the month of June, we are going to come up with the video in the next couple of weeks. Now, having said that, for all of you who are interested in cementing your preparation for the examination for 2026-27, now we have come up with a lucrative offer of 19,999 plus up to 12 months of free extension. Now you will get the availability of top class lectures for all GS subjects and CSAT. You will be able to complete all of them. Use the code IS English and thereby ensure that the timely preparation is completed. Having said that, there is another article which has appeared in page 1 of the newspaper today, and that is that railway is mulling increasing the fares in a marginal quantity itself from July 1. Now, that article dealing with the economic aspect of the railways and the requirement of increase in the fares charged from the passengers, that session will be taken by Sham sir, who will discuss it in greater detail about why that is important and what are the intricacies associated with railways requirement of fare. So, do look out on the channel, and that video in economics will be uploaded today evening. Now, let us start with the first article, the editorial section, a reset in West Asia, a de escalation for the world. Now, this is something which we are going to merge with the nuclear spectre. Both of these articles have appeared in the editorial section. Now, what do these articles talk about? Now, they talk about the reality in the region of West Asia, which has been unfolding very quickly in front of our own eyes. And in the past week and a half, volatility is an underrated term, so to say. Basically, we have seen that how Israel, which started initially the war or initially an offensive against Iran's nuclear enrichment facility, and very quickly that broadened in horizon and that morphed itself into a kind of a full-fledged war. Now, the damage which was caused in Iran was humongous, but at the same time, Israel and substantial amount of Israeli region was also damaged. So these regions have experienced damage, but at the same time, after a long period of time, we have seen that this issue between Iran and Israel that has morphed into something larger. Iran launched an attack against the US base in Qatar, and that drew Qatar into the controversy itself. Now, had the ceasefire not been announced the way that it was, and US taking a tough stance, one could imagine Qatar being drawn into this kind of a conflict, and Saudi Arabia also started pitching in and adding fuel to the fire, talking about the danger that the Iranian state posed. So, what do you see in front of your very own eyes if you break it all down? There was an intervention between Israel and Iran. US came in as an outside force. But very soon, it was not restricted to Iran and Israel itself. Qatar was drawn in, Saudi Arabia was drawn in, Syria was being drawn in, Iraq was being drawn in. So you had multiple fronts opening across the region of West Asia. Fire has been announced. But while announcing the ceasefire, new chasms and new divides have opened up in the region of West Asia. So let us discuss this threadbare and let us analyze the growing geopolitical situations and divides that we see unfolding in front of our own eyes. Now, the context of the couple of these, both of these articles is the announcement of ceasefire. One of the very damning and important things to notice is the silence of the allies. Which allies are we talking about? We are in this particular case talking about the allies of Iran. Now, Iran is not a country which has been formed after, let's suppose, decolonization, a state which has come into existence very recently. It is not that case. Iran is a kind of a historical state, a historical nation state, which has been in existence for thousands of years, and it has had traditional allies for many decades now. Allies not only in the region of West Asia, but also allies, powerful allies, so to say, like Russia, China, and so for a long period of time. India also used to be a great ally and a natural strategic ally of Iran. But owing to the US sanctions which have been imposed in Iran for the past couple of decades, India's engagement with Iran has reduced. Having said that, it is not as if we have no interest in Iran. When it comes to a country like Iran, India is still dependent on it, and India still has a lot of things going for it, starting with the people to people partnership. When we talk about the India centric stance of Iran, India Iran, when you talk about it. So you have the people to people connect. Now, as you would have seen under Operation Sindhu, which was to rescue the people who were trapped and the Indian citizens who were trapped in these war zones of Iran and Israel. A lot of Indians are studying in the medical colleges and other institutions like the Shah Beheshti Institute in Iran. So there is a large and a deeper people to people connect, cultural connect does exist. Now, other than that, India is also eyeing access to the region of Afghanistan and eyeing the access to the region of Central Asia through the Chabahar port. Chabahar port, again, is going to be an important fulcrum in the development of the Iranian region, other than the all important Bandar Abbas port. So, there again, the Chabahar port. Chabahar port is another one of those. Other than that, what is it that India and Iran have in common? Now, Iran is a large supplier, again, of crude oil, fossil fuel, natural gas. It is true that we have shifted our supply and dependence of crude oil and fossil fuel to other countries like Russia and so on. But nonetheless, Iran remains a large supplier across the globe. China is still one of the heavy importers of crude oil from the region of Iran. So, when it comes to energy reserves, there again, we have something to actually gain from Iranian relationship. And then second, a part which we oftentimes ignore. That is the case of our agrarian society. Now, India is a country where still you have around 50% of the population, 45 to 50% of the population, who are directly and indirectly associated with agricultural sector. Now, in agriculture, we do know soil fertility is very important. Now, across the globe, all the different types of soil that you have, all those soils, they are poor in nitrogen. They are deficient in nitrogen. And nitrogen is an important elemental nutrient which the plants require. So that is why, what do we do? As a fertilizer, we apply urea. Now, Iran is one of those suppliers of urea from whom and for which we have been dependent on the country for almost many decades now. So this is again one of those regions where we source and used to source our fertilizers. So these are multiple. Other than that, you have minor agricultural products like dry fruits, spices, saffron, etc., which again is something that Iran does export. But Iran holds a center position in the region of West Asia, which cannot simply be shrugged under the carpet. But when the bombings were happening in Iran, it Russia, China, India, all the other countries, they chose a strategic ambiguity or a kind of strategic silence. Because US was involved in this case, and if you stood with Iran, you are openly standing against you. India had other predicament to consider as well. In the last month, when we did launch Operation Sindoor against the terrorists in Pakistan, Israel was the only country which openly stood with India and supported India's stance against terrorism. So, just next month, India cannot be seen across the global community as straight away opposing Israel. So, that is why India was in a kind of a conundrum. India was trapped in a kind of a fix. So that is why you did not observe a very strong statement from India either. Nonetheless, India did play its part by continuously voicing its opinion and the requirement of peace. Now, West Asia, now, with the entire bombardment and the kind of offensive which was carried out relentlessly for the past week and 10 days, has now basically disarmed Iran of its nuclear enrichment facility. Now, even though there are reports that 400 kg of uranium is still missing, something which can be enough to make 10 nuclear bombs, but the reality of the matter is that when it comes to developing its own nuclear enrichment and the nuclear weapons, Iran is at a back foot. So now the entire region of West Asia has got one nuclear power, and that is the country of. And the predicament of it is, and so to say, the hypocrisy of it, if you take a look at it and analyze it carefully, you have the NPT, the Non Proliferation Treaty. Now, Iran was a signatory and has been a signatory to NPT, whereby the countries agree that they will not engage in proliferation of nuclear technology, weapons with each other. And that is a kind of a safeguard mechanism. Also, understand one thing: Iran voluntarily, that is, in the past decade, Iran voluntarily agreed to an international overseeing safeguard mechanism where International Atomic Energy Council would take a look at Iran's nuclear enrichment facility, and Iran allowed that. Iran agreed to that. But what happened on the side of the US or the global power? US encouraged Iran to participate in that global monitoring. And then when Donald Trump came into power, US backtracked. Again, when Iran wanted its sanctions to be removed, again US stepped in and backtracked. But on the other hand, take a look at Israel. Now, Israel has been a nation which has been friendly to India, that is true. But on the other side of the coin, if you analyze it, Israel again basically is a non signatory to NPT. Israel does not allow international overseeing and regulatory mechanisms to look at its nuclear arsenal. Israel is not using the nuclear weapons or not keeping the nuclear weapons as deterrents, but as a kind of a force multiplier that, if required, we can use the nuclear weapons in other countries. Now, despite all these three red signals and a kind of red light out there, Israel is still the only nation in West Asia now which has got nuclear weapons. Rest of the nuclear weapons of the region have been disarmed. That is the hypocrisy of the modern geopolitical world that we live in. Now, why is it bad? It is bad on multiple fronts. First of all, it sets a bad precedent. Why? Because Iran, what we just discussed, after overseeing all this, after allowing for all this inspection and willing to go for a kind of an international agreement, still faces the backlash of the Western powers. Now, in this particular case, what will happen? The countries overall across the world will take a cue from this. That look, Iran had signed NPT, and still the other countries were not convinced. Iran had agreed not to enrich its uranium, and still it was bombarded. Had Iran got nuclear weapons, then maybe the other countries would have been more considerate. So that would incentivize the other countries to start gaining nuclear weapons of their own. Because the uncertainty in the Western world is too apparent for everyone to. Now, Israel gets a free pass regardless of what it does. Now, more than 56,000 people, as per the article, have been killed in the region of Gaza. Now, think about it, killing 56,000 people in a span of a few months and a couple of years. That is massive. And that includes not only the women and the children that you see on the TV screens every other day, but also humanitarian aid rescuers. Now, despite doing all this, Israel had the wherewithal to open up a second front with a nation powerful like Iran. Now, a country like Israel can never do it unless and until it has a carte blanche or a kind of a full backing from US. So, US support in this case also exposes the hypocrisy of the West, whereby if we do it, it is fine, but you should not do it. That is what makes the strategic thinkers and the think tanks in countries like India much more frustrated. Where we have clear evidence of terrorist cells in our western neighbor in Pakistan, but US on the other hand calls the field marshal one of the visionary people. But when it comes to Israel, everything allowed. Now, violation of global norms. You see, what started as the initial motive between Israel and Iran? It was basically damaging and disarming the nuclear development and nuclear enrichment facilities. That is it. But then, within a few hours, Israel escalated it to a full scale war. Now, it started bombing Tehran, with the US president even expressing it on social media, everyone evacuate Tehran immediately. Now, this easily is one of the first of its kind, where you have the most powerful individual of the world talking about one capital city to be evacuated immediately. So, from disarming the nuclear enrichment sites to evacuation of Tehran to destruction of facilities in the entirety of the region of Iran, the aim was something different. And nuclear armament facilities or nuclear enrichment facilities appear to be a mere facade. Now, this also exposes certain new dilemmas which the world must deal with. What is it? First of all, it indicates a complete failure and breakdown of global governance. Now, in the past couple of years, we have had kinetic disputes. Now, disputes do exist between multiple nations, but kinetic disputes do exist between Russia, Ukraine, do exist and did exist between the region of Israel and Palestine, did exist between India and Pakistan, did exist between now Israel and Iran, Iran and Qatar, Saudi Arabia and Iran. In the entirety of this discussion of kinetic warfare, Armenia, Azerbaijan, in all of these, in all these kinetic actions, United Nations name is not even mentioned in any of the conflicts. UN peacekeeping force, the United Nations, the blue helmets, they have disappeared. Disappeared not only from the public discourse, but disappeared from the problem solving mechanism completely. So, this is a further reinforcement of the argument that India has been making, that global governance is completely broken. And we are now completely in the era pre Second World War, where it is up to each and every nation, depending upon their strength. If they can take something, they can. And if they are willing to sacrifice something, they are absolutely so. There is no such UN charter. 56,000 people have been killed. The war in Gaza continues to rage on. So that is a very dangerous possibility that the world is staring at. But another dangerous possibility that this conflict has indicated was the fact that when it comes to leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu, now they have been strongmen in the region of Israel for some time now. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu saw his political outcomes and dividend dipping in the recent past. And it is said that the war against Iran has further strengthened his political backing. Now, this is also indicating a kind of a dangerous possibility. That is, political gains in the domestic spectrum are pushing the countries to the brink of war. Even when we take a look at Donald Trump, the ever entertaining and the ever enlightened president of the US. Now, Donald Trump, in his actions, in his speeches, and more importantly, in his tweets and in his declarations on social media, has been pandering to his own constituency. Now, his own constituency, they are heavily pro Israel. So, you could never expect Donald Trump to take an action which would be anti. So, despite the announcement of the ceasefire, when the US announced ceasefire, that is one of the things that Donald Trump specializes in. Now, immediately after that, Israel did launch its bombers against Iran. Now, think about the impunity of the action and think about the kind of freedom that if you are a US ally, you get to experience. So that is where the domestic politics is entering the international spectrum, which is as dangerous as it can be. Now, so to say, what stops China tomorrow to do the same thing in the region of Taiwan? Right. So this is again indicating an era where neocolonialism is justified in the name of, let's suppose, the fight for freedom. Now, arming of the West Asian nation. Now, when Iran did attack Qatar, now what would Qatar do? Qatar immediately issued a statement that we are going to attack Iran again. Now, Saudi Arabia also jumped in. And mind you, these are not some random countries with some riflemen out there. They have well developed militaries. When we talk about the Rafale jet in case of India's invincibility, you have to understand that across the global buyers of Rafale jet, Qatar also has its name there. And it is one of the fastest procurers of these jets. So we are not talking about some insignificant militaries out there. This further would fuel a race of arms and an arms race to the bottom, where each and every country would want to get armed to their teeth. Now, the military industrial complex in the Western nations would obviously benefit out of it. China would benefit out of it. But when it comes to peace in the world, that is out of the window. Now, earlier, what used to exist? The global order. Earlier, economic costs were always weighed in. And when you had a large economic cost, people would never engage in a long term war. But what you are seeing now, pushing Iran to such a brink that Iran was virtually forced to pass in its parliament the aspect of blocking the Strait of Hormuz. Now, blocking the Strait of Hormuz would, in a way, stifle all the oil-rich economies in the Persian Gulf, would lead to a kind of a supply gap and a kind of an inflation in the region of India, China, and so on. So the economic cost would be huge. This would lead to job losses and cascading impact in the countries for months now. But still, the countries pursue the agenda of war. So that is the new reality. Humanitarian grounds, how many people are killed, how many people die. That is something obviously which is last on the agenda. So this indicates a new reality that we do live in. Now, the destruction in many regions of Tel Aviv and Haifa in Israel has been underreported. But if ground reports from Reuters, etc., are to be believed in, the damage and the deaths, even in Israel, has been massive. But then still, Israel claims it as a kind of a victory. And this is where the political gains aspect comes into the picture. So, what is the reality that we see? Now, you see, Israel has been doing this with Iran in a very systematic manner. First of all the countries in the western part of Asia, they were slightly wary of Iran because Iran had a kind of a heft. Iran was a kind of a power of West Asia, a large military, a well armed military, an efficient army, but at the same time, not only the conventional armament and the conventional strength. Iran, through its proxies in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, in all these regions, would control the entirety of West Asia. Due to which the West Asia and the West Asian countries, they were looking to normalize the relations with Israel, looking at the fact that only Israel can suppress Iran. So they allowed Israel to do whatever Israel wanted. So this was a kind of a pandering, a kind of an appeasement of Israel. Now, as a consequence, Israel slowly and steadily defanged the kind of proxies that Iran had in Syria, first of all, then in the region of Iraq, and now it is targeting the Houthis in Yemen. Houthis in Yemen are one of the final strongholds of the proxies that the Iranians has. Now, rest of the West Asian nations, they feel powerful enough to challenge this weakened Iran. And defense flows from a position of strength. Defense does not follow. So when the other West Asian nations, they feel powerful enough to challenge Iran, that brings in a new era of conflict and a new era of warfare in front. So this is how this ceasefire, in a way, can lead to much more vulnerability, drawing multiple countries in. Now, when we talk about the nuclear spectre, that is something which has been unraveling in front of us like a Christmas gift, showing the unexpected, so to. Now, for a long period of time, the global order and the global consensus, nuclear disarmament is the way to. And when you had nuclear powers like US and Russia fighting with each other, it was easy to monitor them that, okay, denuclearization in US and Russia would be sufficient. But when the world became unipolar, that US became the only large nuclear powered state and Russia's power was declining, US ensured that the other countries would not gain nuclear weapons. Now, how would US do that? US would do that by ensuring and guaranteeing the other countries a kind of a protection umbrella in case there is an aggression, a foreign aggression. Why do countries keep nuclear weapons? Nuclear weapons are kept not to be used in warfare. Nuclear weapons are kept so that there is no warfare. It is a deterrent. It is not an armament. So that nuclear weapons countries like Ukraine, etc., they shunned and they basically allowed the disarmament to happen, expecting a US protection. But then US in itself is experiencing a leadership which can change its minds its entire mind within 24 hours, depending upon what do you say about the US president. If you have good words to say about the US president, then US policy will be pro that country. Now, what that has led to, countries like Ukraine, Iran, etc., they have realized a greater importance of weapons. Countries like Pakistan, they would feel absolutely blessed that they have armed themselves with nuclear weapons in an appropriate time. Now, this is an incentivization for armament rather than leading to a world of disarmament. So that is where not only is there a breakdown of global governance, but incentive for procuring nukes. The treaties like the Non Proliferation Treaty, NPT, that again has been thrown out of the window. Whether you have signed or you have not signed, if you are on the good books of US, you are free to do whatever you want. If you are on the bad books, you are done for. That again indicates a lust for power, a lust for strength that the world is heading to. So, this is the reality of the geopolitical world that these couple of articles have indicated. I hope it is understood and grasped in greater detail. Now, here, nukes means nuclear weapons. Let us take a look at the practice question. The vulnerabilities in West Asia seem to be expanding rather than being elaborate. Now, here, what will you write in the answer? Without testing how Israel recognized as nuclear power. Israel has had nuclear weapons. That is how you get recognized as a nuclear power. Now, where does Israel get its nuclear weapons from? It has developed on its own, but through the 60s and the 70s, before the Yom Kippur War itself, it is said that US has supplied substantial amount of nuclear weapons to Israel. So that is where Israel becomes one of those other nuclear armed states in the region of West Asia. Now, vulnerabilities of West Asia seem to be expanding rather than being resolved. What do you write in that? In the intro. Intro, you talk about the realities of West Asia. West Asia indicates a fragmented geopolitical order where countries of conflicting interests are continuously at loggerheads over the past many decades in order to achieve the set agenda. The inclusion of global powers like US, Russia, and China has made the situation much more volatile rather than solving. That will be your intro, right? So, geopolitical reality, political reality. Now, after that, what is the demand of the question? That is something you have to understand. The demand of the question is basically to talk about what are the issues in West Asia, which are rather than getting resolved, are rather conflicting. So, that is where in the body you talk about the issue. In these issues, do you talk about Israel Palestine? Do. Israel Palestine, then after that, talk about Israel Iran, then after that, talk about Iran Saudi, then Iran Qatar, then the kind of proxies where even Hamas, then Syria, Yemen in the form of Houthis who are damaging the shipping lane, and then Iraq. Okay? Then you address the role of the mischievous in chief, that is US, and the US backing of Israel. All these points you do mention. Now, even though it is a 15 marker and it is not asking you as a way forward, as a solution, but still following the 70-30 rule, do talk about it. Once you have talked about the challenges, the conclusion should be a kind of a word way forward. The need of the hour is for the global community of nations to come together and ensure a peaceful transition into dialogue. Because, as famously said, this is not an era of war that we live in, and no agenda or no objective can be achieved without coming at the table of dialogue. So, that is something where you can conclude, provide a way forward about the dialogue, the willingness of the countries like Iran to come on the negotiating table, the softening of the stance by US, maintenance of stance by global powers, and continuum in their policy framework. That is the need. So, like that, you can conclude. Okay. Now, then after that, the need for Hamas is an Iranian proxy. No, see, it is not a direct Iranian proxy out there, but then Israel has always alleged that the arming and the armament of Hamas, that is something which is done by Iran indirectly, the arms that they get. So that is the allegation which is okay. Now, the need for gender equity in urban bureaucracy. Now, this is basically changes to UN can also be used as a way forward. Yes, absolutely. Correct. Do write the answer. Now, gender equity in urban bureaucracy. Now, when we talk about urban governance, we have to keep one thing in mind. As per the last census of 2011, we have 35% of the population which is living in urban areas, and the rural to urban migration in the country is massive. India as a country is seeking to attain a status of $5 trillion economy. Now, this $5 trillion, that stature or that milestone is going to be achieved only when the urban centers they act as the engines of growth. They cannot be the laggards, they have to be the engines of. Now, these urban centers, they have you have various issues in all the urban areas of our country. The frequent flooding during the rains, the power cut, the heat waves, the traffic jams, all of them indicate a complete breakdown of urban administration and urban governance and planning model as well. To add to the woes, gender inequity is massive in urban areas. When we talk about gender inequity, what do we exactly mean by this? And why is it that gender equity is required in urban planning? So, listen and understand to this very carefully for the next couple of minutes. You will understand the entire article associated. So, think about it. When we talk about any urban area, male population, female population. Now, study and researchers have indicated that female population in general, they take the help of public transportation much greater in proportion as compared to males. This, they will use the buses, the local trains in much greater proportion as compared to male. Because the male members in the urban areas, they tend to use their own vehicles in greater proportion. Now, when it comes to pedestrian areas like footpath, walking from one region to another, there again, the female population tends to use them more as compared to male population. What do we observe in all the urban regions of the country? When it comes to the urban governance, for example, public transportation, very little amount of funding, very bad quality of public transportation. What do we observe when it comes to footpaths and such kind of facilities in urban areas? Absolutely ill maintained rather than footpaths. You have the blocks, one drain after another. Then, when it comes to street lighting, very important for women's safety. Again, lighting is absolutely and woefully inadequate. Many areas are in perpetual darkness, increasing the security risk that the women face. Now, what is the outcome of that? The outcome is something which is indicative in the labor force participation by women. Will a or would it be the case that a woman or a girl would feel safe in such a kind of a backdrop, go out in a greater distance to pursue their jobs, to pursue their hobbies or whatever it might be? Absolutely not. The family in itself will feel more secure if the girls and the women are there within the house and within the limits of the society. Why? Because they are uncertain of the city that lies in front of them. Now, what is that leading? A very low gender female labor force participation. In India, the female labor force participation, as indicated by reports by IMF, have indicated that the labor force participation in India for women is close to around 27 to 30. Just to give you an idea, when it comes to country like China, the female labor force participation is around 62%. Think about it, we are staring at almost half of it. So that means a direct economic loss. But more than that, it is the woman empowerment which is being so that is why gender equity is the need when we talk about the urban bureaucracy. But then the argument can also be that when it comes to urban local bodies, the bodies of local governance, the municipalities, there you do have certain required seat for women as per the 73rd and the 74th Amendment. And that has been strengthened by multiple states, like the certain states, they have increased that limit to 50%. Then what is the gender equity that we are talking about? So while in many of the urban mayoral posts, etc., you do have women who are there in that position now. But when it comes to the executing arm, when it comes to, let's suppose, the IAS, when it comes to the police services, the representation of women is abysmally low. And that is indicated mostly by a kind of a tokenism that you have women just to fill certain roles. Because it is the reality that the article talks about that they are still not trusted to execute a foolproof gender budgeting or, let's suppose, gender equitable planning of the urban area. In many departments like the police force, the article argues that the role of women is restricted to the desk jobs that they perform. So that is the condition and the reality that we live in. And obviously, there is a proof because the cities need to be a region of empowerment rather than a region of discouragement. Okay? Now, the context. India is undergoing significant urban transformation with over 800 million people expected to live in the cities by 2050. Think about it. Greater than the population of many countries brought together. They will be living in the urban cities. Now, this urban expansion, which in itself is facing multiple different obstacles and various different hindrances, that needs to be overhauled. And that is where you have gender equity being promoted by constitutional measures like 33% of the seats in PRIs and urban local governance being increased to 50% in certain regions by the state machinery itself. But then what is the cause of concern? The representation in the administration is still very low, a high single digit or a low double digit. Be it IAS, IPS, local bodies, everywhere. Execution and administrative arms, they are dominated by men, and it ignores the issues which are faced by women. And that is where all these issues that I've talked about, like installation of street lighting, the refurbishment of public transportation network, the revamping of the footpath and pedestrian crossings, they often take a kind of a backseat in the planning process. Now, what is the need for gender equity in planning? So, this is basically where women rely more on public transportation and walk more. Note, studies indicate women officials, when they are in power, they tend to pay greater attention to public safety, health, sanitation, and overall availability of water, electricity, the basic requirements of a healthy life. So that is a gender sensitive issue and a gender sensitive administrative technique also, which has been implemented and which has been found to be present when you have women heads in these areas. Now, the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations and UN Women highlight, all of these highlight that gender diverse institutions, they improve the trust mechanism governance. Now, gender responsive budgeting. What is gender responsive budgeting? That the budgetary allocation that you carry out in terms of planning purposes and so on, that keeps in mind the gender inequities and seems to provide or seeks to provide a kind of an equitable system. Now, till now, it has been absent in our country in most of the cases. barring few of the states like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Delhi has taken certain steps in this initiative and in this region. But overall, across the country, it has been ignored. Whereas when you compare the countries, I'm not even talking about developed Western European or Nordic countries like Norway, Sweden, etc. I'm talking about contemporary developing nations like Philippines, like Mexico. These nations, Rwanda, these nations have made gender budgeting a kind of a priority. We are lagging behind. Now, Delhi, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala, they adopted the gender responsive budgeting statement since 2005 and 6. Understand, the rest of the world started adopting it since the 1990s and in certain cases since 1980s. When have we started, and that too in select states? 2005 6. Now, Kerala came across a kind of a model for the People's Plan campaign with gender goals. There was an effort on the side of Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Delhi to improve the lighting across the streets, to make it pedestrian friendly, and to improve the public transportation. But again, the progress has been very limited. Why? Because of one reason that we talked about: execution and administrative arms. They have very less proportion of women. So the entire exercise is seen as tokenism. This is a word that you have to use when you write the answer, because tokenism is the reality of the political aspect when it comes to local governance, when it comes to women reservation as of now. Global best practices, here are certain examples. Rwanda, improved maternal health and education. Brazil, look at the example. South Korea, Tunisia, Philippines. We are not even talking about developed nations. And all of them, through their gender budgeting and gender responsive budgeting and planning, they have managed to turn a page. And they are trying to. We have a lot of catching up to do. Now, what is the way forward? Labor force participation of women is not only an aid to gain economic growth, but also an important spectrum to gain women empowerment. That is what will give them freedom and self confidence. For that, you need to have cities, which are engines of the future growth, cities as regions, model regions for gender equity. This is where India has to improve. And that is where inclusiveness in planning, in execution, when it comes to civil society organizations and their feedback, that needs to be taken the next level. Till that does not happen, all the discussions that we continuously have about gender equity, about gender parity, this is all going to be theoretical. Any improvement in rankings when it comes to gender equity index and so on, that again is going to be mental at level best. So this is the kind of a way forward that must be done, that must be enforced if we want our city real engines of growth. You cannot grow economically if you ignore 50% of the population which lives in the urban area. And that is the reality that India must come to grip. Okay? Now, here, let us take a look at the practice question. Discuss the need for gender based budgeting in urban planning. Now, what is it that you write in the intro? Restricted to caregiving sector, very good, right? Now, can we suggest the replication of scaling of initiatives of women's safety? Pink buses of Bihar, yes, that was in news recently. Yes, Manisha, we can use that. Right. What will be the intro for this particular question? Need for gender based budgeting in urban planning. In the intro, you have to talk about what is gender based budgeting, right? So, that is where you talk about the budgetary allocation and the planning, keeping in mind the gender equity and gender parity to ensure that all sections of the society get benefited from the planning process. Now, that full stop, one sentence. Next sentence in the intro where you write, the requirement of gender based budgeting is acute and immediate in a country like India where the disparities are very large. Now, that provides a context and the flow for the body. And that is where in the body you talk about the female labor force participation, the case of the gender equity index that we discussed last week in the CNA. You talk about the political participation. You talk about how cities are turning out to be the regions of discrimination rather than regions of empowerment. You talk about that when you have also the gender based budgeting, the gender based and the gender responsive budgeting, in those cases, more attention is given to sanitation, healthcare, water, etc. Those factors you list. Then public transportation, pedestrian crossways, lighting in the streets, all those factors you mentioned. So thereby you will be able to elaborate the need. Now, then it is a 15 marker question. So the conclusion also has to include some part of the way forward. Now, what is the way forward? In the way forward, you can write that as a country, there is a requirement for greater political participation, but at the same time, greater grassroots level participation of women in the policy framing and execution process. We as a country cannot dream to grow by ignoring 50% of the population. So, the need of the hour is to ensure greater feedback and input from the civil society organizations, from the women groups, and ensure that the labor force participation to ensure that overall participation in the society is high. Like that, you can conclude. Okay. Um, Women workforce participation, you definitely have to mention. Allocation of funds, yes, but that is how you have to frame it. Um, to be ready for such questions, can we keep a rough note of the existing? You can, but then keep a general trend analysis rather than getting fixated on individual numbers. Take a look at the global factors as well and the global examples also you can indicate. Okay? Now, after that, some of the topics that we are going to discuss in brief, relevant for your prelims. One is a detailed article which has appeared in page 10, that is US's heavy duty attack on Iran's sites, nuclear. Now, this has been in news for almost days now. Now, US has successfully carried out an attack with the stealth bombers that it has. Now, stealth. Stealth is again the word of the year, so to say, whereby every other conflict is talking about the requirement of stealth and detection of the so-called stealth. Now, US operates some of the stealth bombers and the stealth fighters. What do we mean by stealth? Basically, when any fighter jet or any aircraft does move, now it can be detected by its RCS or radar cross section. On the radar screen, it is the RCS which allows the radar to detect it and accordingly have a countermeasure deployed. Now, stealth bombers or stealth fighters, they have a very low to negligible RCS where they appear and disappear over the radar screen. So you cannot deploy anti-aircraft missiles, guns, surface-to-air missiles, etc. And that is where the damage is. Now, US is one of those nations which has deployed stealth to start with, right? Now, when we talk about the US, their B-2 bombers that US has deployed, the image that you see, B-2 bombers are the actual stealth aircrafts, complete stealth aircraft. Now, the design of it in itself is very unique. It doesn't have a tail, right? So it has a kind of a large wing and a wingspan of almost 52 meters, half the football field. Other than that, US has also deployed stealth jets in the form of the first stealth fighter that the world saw in the form of F-22 Raptor and also F-35 Lightning. That is the US arsenal of stealth weapons. But when it comes to B-2 bombers, now these B-2 bombers you have to understand. So basically, when we talk about stealth, this is where it can be relevant for UPSC because in this year's prelims also, the aircraft and their specialty was asked. So B-2 is a bomber. So what is the difference between an F-22 and F-35 or a B2. How is B2 different? Now, B2, with a twin pilot configuration, it has got a special coating on its surface, which requires it to be put in temperature controlled hangars, which is temperature sensitive, otherwise, the coating gets degraded. Now, once the coating gets degraded, it can be detected by the radars. Because this coating, what it does, it absorbs the signal sent by the radar. And as a consequence, it is invisible on the radar screen. Now, B2 is a bomber, means it can carry heavy or armaments, right? Like the GBU MOPs, that were the bunker busters which were deployed in the case of Iran's nuclear facilities like Fordo. Now, here, like this, US has had multiple different bombs. But then, B2 is a true stealth. Here, you have to understand that maintenance of B2 is very costly. Maintenance of this requires, for every 1 hour of flight, it does require almost 100 hours of maintenance, which is huge. And it is very costly as well. One fighter jet can easily cost you close to around $2 billion. US as of now has got a reduced arsenal of only around 18 to 19 such B2 bombers. In order to maintain the armed supremacy, US has issued a fresh tender to the private military supplier which has built that is Northrop Grumman. Now Northrop Grumman basically has won the contract to develop the B-21 bombers which are going to follow this. So this is for the stealth weaponry. But US is not the only country which has got these stealth weapons and the stealth bomb. China is following close in its quarters along with Russia as well. Russia, however, is still struggling with Su-57, the Sukhoi 57, where India had also put in a lot of developmental funds, but later on, owing to configuration challenges and the challenge of the sharing and the transfer of technology, which Russia denied that we will not transfer technology, India marked an end to that collaboration for the joint development of Sukhoi 7. Also, one of the points of conflict was Russia was interested in single pilot development of the jet, whereas India wanted a twin pilot version. If you look at almost all the aircraft, the heavy aircrafts that we have in our arsenal, most of them are twin pilot, including the Sukhois. So that is what India wanted. So India exited this program, but now Ministry of Development MOD is looking actively at Sukhoi 57, and if some sources are to be believed, that if Russia agrees to transfer some of the technology, India will be ready to buy Su 57. On the other hand, you have the contemporary on the northern border, that is China. Now, China has deployed some of the stealth fighters of its own, the so called stealth fighters. That is the J-20s, which it has more than 200 in its arsenal operating for a few years now. Now, the export version of it, that is J-35s, that again is basically this is by China. Now, this is where the J-35s are stealth bombers, fifth generation fighters, not bombers, but fighters, which will be provided to Pakistan this year at a 50% discounted rate. So, again, Pakistan is going to have the stealth fighter, but India, the earliest that we are seeing the induction of a stealth fighter is 2035 with the development of our indigenous program, that is AMCA. Now, that is where the government has pursued the local industries, HAL, to work on this, but that has been going on for a decade. And even if we take a very optimistic estimate, absolutely optimistic estimate, still the earliest induction of AMCA is going to be from 2035. So we are already lagging almost 2 decades behind when it comes to China and, so to say, when Pakistan. On the other hand, just on the shape of this and the design parameter of this, where you have a tailless fighter which is developed, China has brought a flight simulation and also a flight demonstration of two other so-called sixth generation fighters, that is J-36 and J-50, right? So this is basically the aspect of stealth armament going across the world and where stand. On on top of it, US had also deployed these bunker busters, which have been talked about in great detail. These are massive armaments which basically penetrate the concrete or up to 200 foot of earth, and thereby they carry out the explosion. Now, the basic dynamics behind them is that they are front heavy. So, being front heavy, these bombs, when they are dropped in the air, they basically gain a vertical position very soon, and eventually they gain supersonic speed because they are dropped from a greater height. Now, this supersonic speed and a specialized reinforced concrete across the armament allows them to a reinforced, not concrete, but reinforced steel rather, reinforced steel around these armaments. They allow them to penetrate the concrete up till a greater depth and carry out detonation. So that is the armament part which is relevant for the prelim. Okay. Now, for first time, India breaks into top 100 in global SDG ranking, the Sustainable Development Goal ranking. Now, when we talk about sustainable development goals, now these were set up as an agenda in 2015 to be achieved by 2030. Now, what this was preceded by was MDG or Millennium Development Goal. Now, obviously, MDGs could not be achieved. The target was to achieve the MDGs by 20. Now, the MDGs could not be achieved by 2015, so it was morphed into SDGs. So, in total, you have 17 SDGs to be achieved by 2030. Now, every other year, you basically have a detailed report which is brought out to indicate various different countries, their willingness to achieve the SDGs, and the programs that they have initiated to ensure that the sustainable development goals are achieved. Now, for your examination, is it important to recall these 17 SDGs? The answer is yes, particularly for the mains examination. It is very important to be able to quote which SDG this particular government scheme is seeking to address or seeking to achieve. So, one by one, you can take a look at the SDG. Now, this report that we are talking about, this is basically Sustainable Development Report. Sustainable Development Report. Okay. This is an annual report which is brought by UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Solutions Network. Okay. So this brings out this report. Okay. What are the key findings of this report this year? Not indicated in the article, but nonetheless, I will give you the highlight for the prelims. Now, these are your overall 17 SDGs. Now, all of them are multifarious and in different spectrum. So I can understand that there will be a kind of difficulty in understanding them. But if you observe this, who released this report? This is the organization which released. It is an annual report. Now, there is a systematic way in which you can understand them and grasp them. If you are good at ratification, then my advice is not required. You would have ratified it by now. But other than that, look at this. First is no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well being, quality education, gender equity. All these basically deal with personal well being. As an individual, what do you require? In order to have a meaningful life, in order to have a kind of a qualified life, what do you need? You don't need hunger, you don't need poverty, you don't need bad health, you need good health, you need good education, right? You need gender equality. Then after that, your surroundings, clean water and sanitation, affordable clean energy, right? then decent work and economic growth. Your surrounding should help your development. So, first, your requirement should be fulfilled, starting with no poverty and no hunger. When that is done, then your surroundings, that is clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, economic requirements, economic growth and decent work, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities. Then comes the larger area: sustainable cities, responsible consumption, the recycling part, climate, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong global institutions, and partnership for them. So, like that, it is the vertical expansion at an individual level. Then comes your periphery, then comes the larger world, and then the partnership that you attain in order to go for a global. So, like that, if you follow this trajectory, you will be able to memorize this very easily if you find a pattern. Okay? Now, here, some of the key pointers which the report has indicated: 190 out of the 193 countries of the UNGA have presented national action plans for advancing the sustainable development. They have also allowed for voluntary national review that makes it transparent. However, there are three countries which have no regard for these kind of VNRs or voluntary national review. Which are those? Surprise, surprise. You have Haiti, Myanmar, and US. US, when it comes to climate goals, when it comes to sustainable goals, is absolutely non participative. But when it comes to advising, when it comes to lecturing other countries, that is where you will find US at the top of the spectrum. So that is where a key kind of MCQ can be framed, because the first instinct of a candidate will never be the case that US is not participating in the process of SDG, because every other day you will find senators, left, right, and center, the president talking about the requirement of development in poorer countries. But then they themselves don't beware of a multiple statement question from here. East and South Asia have outperformed all other regions in SDG progress since 20. European countries continue to top the SDG index when it comes to particularly the Nordic nations. Barbados ranks first, and the US ranks last when it comes to UN backed multilateral, right? Partnership for Global Good, the 17th SDG. In all these, US ranks last, Barbados ranks. Okay? Now, then, an article which has appeared in the science section of the newspaper: crushed stone is being spread across farms to capture carbon. Now, across various countries, it has been observed, including India, Brazil, etc., that you have crushed stone like basalt, etc., which is being spread across the various farmland. Now, the purpose of it is to absorb more carbon. And also, these stones will carry out or will go through a process of natural weathering. Weathering is what? Weathering is the natural in situ breakdown of any particular rock. Natural in situ breakdown. What do we mean? By natural factors, forces of nature, physical, that is heating, cooling, expansion, contraction, rainfall, freezing, melting, thereby growth of biological plants and biological activities by animals, rodents. Also, chemical. For example, when you have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, now rainwater dissolves that carbon dioxide, will form a weak carbonic acid that will fall on the rocks, and thereby this carbonic acid will start dissolving. So that is the process of weathering. Now, weathering will break down the rocks into multiple smaller fragments. Each of these fragments become a source where carbon can be captured, right? Carbon dioxide from the atmosphere can be captured, and carbonates can be created like limestone, etc. Now, this is where you will also come across a process that is enhanced rock weathering. Enhanced rock weathering or accelerated weathering of the rocks in the presence of carbon dioxide, that is aimed at carbon sequestration or carbon capture. Okay, so this is again aimed at removing the greenhouse gas from the atmosphere, providing a level of cooling. Okay, so weathering occurs naturally when rain falls on the rocks, and the process can lock away carbon dioxide from the air or the soil as bicarbonate and eventually limestone. So, the carbonic acid, where the rainfall dissolves the carbon dioxide, forms a carbonic acid. When carbon dioxide in the air or soil dissolves, this basic principle was exploited by UPSC last year when it asked this question. It had a three statement question. Rainfall is one of the reasons for the weathering of rocks. Rainwater contains carbon dioxide in solution. Rainwater also contains atmosphere. Now, here, which of the statements or following statements is correct in respect of the above statement? So, take a look at this. Let me know what the answer is. I hope it is easier to solve this now. Basically, when you have the presence of carbon dioxide in the rainwater, then what happens? Does it allow for weathering? Yes or no? That is all that is asked here. Let me know what is the answer in the comment section below. Now, central banks eye gold, euro, and yuan as dollar wanes. Now, the unpredictability when it comes to the US Fed, the kind of central bank of the US, the policy cycle, and the political intervention when it comes to the US monetary policy has been so humongous. And the kind of the pendulum like shift that the US policy is indicating has, in a way, ensured that the global central banks they are moving away from keeping dollar as the reserve currency anymore. The demand for euro has increased. Euro, the demand is increasing, and please understand that this demand for euro has been increasing after a long period of time. Across the central banks in the world, demand for euro had declined after the euro crisis in 2008 to 2009, which was led by US. The economic crisis, the economic meltdown was initiated in the region of US, but it quickly spread across the region of Europe. And then you had fragile economies in Europe, further like Spain, Greece, etc., which required bailout, further worsening the crisis of euro. So euro across the central banks were not preferred. So after almost post 2011, for the first time after that, euro is staging and making a very, very strong comeback. And that is indicative of where the policy shift is going to be in the future. But also, along with that, all the central banks, they are also keeping gold as a reserve because gold is one of the reliable reserves. And that also is indicative of the fact that going ahead into the future, the gold prices are further expected to escalate. But the surprising entry into the central banks is, or not so surprising, so to say, is the holding of yuan. Yuan, the reserve of that and the demand for that has been increasing, representing an overall currency holding to the tune of almost 6% within the next decade, which indicates that very soon, despite yuan not being one of the hard currency basically means one of those preferred currencies where the countries want to have the trade transaction in. So, as of now, the hard currencies that the global central banks keep are basically dollar, pound sterling, euro, yen, and so on. But now yuan is entering the fray, and that will further increase China's economic or predator diplomacy that it follows, where it ensures that the other countries pay it back only in yuan terms. So that will be accepting a kind of a Chinese hegemony in the case of global economic order. And this is led by the withdrawal of US from the global spectrum. Now, a place in news. I now having said that, I hope we are watching the places in news and the species in news that has been put on the YouTube channel, and we are making our own for that. Now, the places in news for the month of June will be released in the first Saturday of July. Species in news for the month of June, second Saturday of July. Now, the region of Greece has been in news, that is the island of Chios in the Aegean Sea, owing to the fire, the wildfire, which has been spreading over the region. So, for us, it is important to know where this island of Chios is and where the Aegean Sea. So, this is the region of Greece, and this is the area. Okay, this is the Aegean Sea, which is also one of the remnants of the old Tethys Sea. For those of us who have forgotten, it was the Tethys Sea, which was present between India and Eurasia, and the collision of the Indian plate subsumed the Tethys Sea and created the mountains that are the Himalayas. So that Tethys Sea at one point of time continued in the entirety of the southern extent of Eurasia, is still to be present in this region of the Aegean. Here, the oceanic crust in this region is amongst the oldest in the world, where the oceanic crust is around 260 to 280 million years. Okay, my here stand for million year. One of the oldest oceanic crust that you find in the world. Okay, so that is what brings us to the end of the discussion today. I hope the discussion was helpful, meaningful, and we have gained some perspective and content. Do try to write the answer. If you have liked the content, put that in the comment section, and don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again tomorrow, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.